The alarm clock screamed at 4 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 12 years. David rolled out of bed, his body moving on autopilot. The world was still dark outside his small apartment window, and the streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. He shuffled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The mirror showed a man in his 30s with tired eyes and calloused hands. He'd given up looking closely at his reflection years ago. What was the point? He brushed his teeth twice, scrubbed his hands with soap until they were raw, and put on the cleanest clothes he could find. It never seemed to make much difference. The walk to Riverside Fish Market took 20 minutes. David had made this journey so many times that his feet knew every crack in the sidewalk, every pothole to avoid. The market was already buzzing with activity when he arrived. Delivery trucks backed up to the loading dock, and vendors shouted instructions to workers hauling crates of ice and seafood. His boss, Mr. Rodriguez, was already there, clipboard in hand. The man barely looked up when David walked in. "You're 3 minutes late," he said, tapping his watch. David checked his own watch. It showed exactly 5 o'clock, their official start time. He didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with Mr. Rodriguez about anything. The morning routine began immediately. David helped unload the trucks carrying heavy boxes of fish from the harbor. Red snapper, salmon, cod, mackerel, shrimp, and dozens of other varieties that most people couldn't even pronounce. His job was to arrange everything on ice, making sure each fish looked fresh and appealing to customers. He had a good eye for this work. David could tell just by looking which fish were the freshest, which ones would sell first, and how to display them so they caught people's attention. He took pride in his arrangements, even though no one ever complimented his work. The fish market was beautiful in its own way, with silver scales catching the overhead lights and the organized chaos of a place where business never stopped. By 7 o'clock, the first customers started arriving. This was always the hardest part of David's day. He watched other vendors chatting easily with their regular customers, laughing at jokes, asking about families. David tried to do the same, but something always went wrong. "Excuse me," a woman in a business suit said, approaching his section. "Do you have any fresh salmon?" David smiled and pointed to his best display. "Right here, ma'am. This came in just 2 hours ago from the coast. Beautiful color, see how firm the flesh is?" The woman leaned in to look, then immediately stepped back. Her nose wrinkled up like she'd smelled something terrible. "Oh my goodness," she muttered loud enough for other customers to hear. "Maybe I'll come back later." She walked away quickly, and David felt his heart sink. He'd showered that morning just like every morning. He'd used extra soap, brushed his teeth twice, and even sprayed cologne on his shirt, but somehow the smell of fish seemed to follow him everywhere. "Dude, you've got to do something about that smell," his coworker Tommy said, walking past with a crate of ice. Tommy was younger, maybe 25, and had only been working at the market for 6 months. "It's like you're marinated in fish juice or something." David forced a laugh. "Yeah, I know. It's the job, right?" "Nah, man. Look at Rodriguez, look at Pete, look at any of us. We all work with fish, but we don't smell like we live in the ocean." Tommy wasn't being mean exactly. He was just stating facts the way young people do, without thinking about how those facts might hurt. The rest of the morning continued the same way. Customers would approach David's section, drawn by his excellent displays, then back away when they got close. Some were polite about it, pretending they'd changed their minds. Others were less kind. "Jesus, what died in here?" one man said loudly, looking right at David. His friends laughed, and they moved to a different vendor. An elderly woman covered her nose with her handkerchief and shook her head. "Young man, you really should see a doctor about that." David's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept working. He rearranged the ice, adjusted the price tags, and helped customers who were brave enough to get close. His sales weren't terrible, actually. Once people got past the smell issue, they usually bought from him because his fish really was fresh and well presented. But those first few seconds of every interaction were painful. During his lunch break, David sat alone on a wooden crate behind the market. The other workers gathered around a picnic table, sharing stories and complaining about difficult customers. They never invited David to join them. It wasn't that they disliked him exactly. They just seemed to forget he existed. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through social media while eating his sandwich. Everyone else seemed to have such normal lives. Photos of friends at restaurants, family gatherings, weekend trips. David couldn't remember the last time someone had invited him anywhere outside of work. The afternoon shift was more of the same. David worked steadily, doing his job well despite the constant rejection. He had developed thick skin over the years, or at least he told himself he had. The comments still stung, but he'd learned not to let them show on his face. As closing time approached, David helped clean the work area and pack away the remaining fish. The market would start the whole cycle again tomorrow morning. Same time, same routine, same struggles. Mr. Rodriguez counted the day's earnings while the workers finished cleaning. "Not bad," he announced. "David, your section did okay today, but try to work on your customer service skills." "People are complaining." David nodded silently. What could he say? That he showered twice every morning? That he'd tried every deodorant and cologne in the store? That he'd even gone to a doctor who told him there was nothing medically wrong with him? The smell of fish just seemed to be part of who he was now. The walk home was peaceful. The streets were busy with people leaving work, going to dinner, meeting friends. David envied their easy conversations and casual laughter. He wondered what it felt like to move through the world without people stepping away from you. Back in his apartment, David finally allowed himself to relax. The first thing he did was take a long hot shower, scrubbing away the day's work. Then he put on clean clothes and heated up a simple dinner. His apartment was small but comfortable. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that barely fit a couch and coffee table. But in the corner, covered by an old sheet, sat his most precious possession, his grandmother's piano. David pulled away the sheet and sat down on the worn bench. The piano was old and needed tuning, but it still worked. He placed his rough, work-worn hands on the keys and began to play. The music that came out was nothing like the man who spent his days surrounded by fish and rejection. It was beautiful, complex, and full of emotion. His fingers moved across the keys with grace and precision, playing pieces he'd memorized years ago when his grandmother was still alive. For the next 2 hours, David forgot about everything else. He forgot about the customers who wrinkled their noses. He forgot about coworkers who excluded him. He forgot about the loneliness that followed him everywhere. When he played piano, he was just David, a man who could create something beautiful. This was his secret, his private world where smell didn't matter and no one could judge him. Here in the quiet of his apartment with only the music for company, David felt like the person he really was inside. 3 weeks later, David was having one of those particularly rough days that seemed to pile problems on top of each other. It started when Mrs. Patterson, a regular customer who usually tolerated him better than most, brought her teenage daughter to the market for the first time. "Mom, why does it smell so bad over here?" the girl said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. "It's like something rotted." Mrs. Patterson looked embarrassed. "Shush, Rebecca. That's not polite, but the damage was done." Other customers turned to look, and David felt his face burn red. The girl wasn't wrong exactly. He knew he carried the scent of his work, but hearing it from someone so young and blunt hit differently. "I'm sorry about that," Mrs. Patterson whispered to David. "Kids, you know." David forced a smile. "No problem at all. What can I get for you today?" After they left, Tommy walked over, shaking his head. "Man, that was brutal. Even for you." "Thanks for the sympathy," David said, trying to keep his voice light. "I'm just saying maybe it's time to think about a different job. There's got to be something else you could do." Tommy meant well, but he didn't understand. David had tried other jobs over the years. He'd worked in a restaurant kitchen until the chef complained about the smell affecting the food. He'd tried retail, but customers avoided him there too. Construction work seemed promising until his crew started eating lunch farther and farther away from wherever he sat. The fish market was the only place that would keep him long term. Mr. Rodriguez cared more about productivity than popularity, and David was good at his job. He knew fish, he worked hard, and he showed up every day. That counted for something. After work, David stopped by the grocery store like he did every Tuesday. He needed milk, bread, and some vegetables for the week. The cashier, a young guy named Kevin, always made small talk with customers. But when David approached his register, Kevin's friendly expression changed. "Paper or plastic?" Kevin asked, not making eye contact. "Plastic is fine," Kevin bagged the grow. Series quickly, holding his breath. When he handed David his receipt, he was careful not to let their hands touch. "Have a good night," he said, already looking past David to the next customer. Walking home, David noticed a colorful flyer taped to a streetlight. Annual Community Talent Show, it read in big cheerful letters. Showcase your skills. All welcome. Registration at Riverside Community Center. David stopped and read it again. A talent show. He'd seen these announcements before over the years, but never paid much attention. Who would want to watch him do anything on stage? But something about the bright colors and encouraging words made him pause. The community center was only 4 blocks from his apartment. David had walked past it hundreds of times, but never been inside. It was a nice building, well-maintained, with big windows that showed people coming and going for various activities. Senior citizen exercise classes, youth basketball, art workshops. Normal people doing normal things. That evening, David sat at his piano as usual. But instead of just playing for himself, he found himself wondering what it would be like to play for other people. Real people. Not just the empty walls of his apartment. His grandmother had always said he had a gift. "David, honey, you play like an angel," she used to tell him. "Someday you should share this with the world." But that was when he was 12 years old, before life got complicated. Before the fish market and the smell and the daily rejection, his grandmother had seen something in him that the rest of the world seemed unable to see. The next day at work was worse than usual. A new customer, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit, approached David's section looking for shrimp for a dinner party. David showed him the best selection, explaining how fresh everything was and even suggesting cooking methods. "This looks good," the man said, seeming pleased. But when David moved closer to bag up the shrimp, the man's expression changed completely. "Oh, wow. No, I think I'll go somewhere else. This is really unpleasant." He walked away quickly, and David heard him talking to another customer near the entrance. "I wouldn't buy anything from that guy if I were you. Something's seriously wrong over there." That was it. David had reached his breaking point for the day. During his lunch break, instead of sitting alone behind the market, he walked to the community center. The building was busier than he'd expected. People were coming in and out, carrying gym bags and art supplies. A bulletin board near the entrance was covered with announcements about classes, events, and volunteer opportunities. The talent show flyer was there too, along with a sign-up sheet. David stood in front of the sheet for a long time. There were already 12 names written in neat handwriting. Jennifer Walsh, singing. The Martinez family, traditional dance. Bob Chen, magic tricks. Susan Williams, poetry reading. Normal people with normal talents. Probably planning normal performances for their normal friends and families. What was David thinking? He didn't belong here. But then he thought about the man in the expensive suit. The teenage girl who'd wrinkled her nose. All the customers who stepped away from him every single day. All the co-workers who forgot to invite him to anything. The cashier who held his breath while ringing up groceries. David picked up the pen and wrote his name at the bottom of the list. David Torres, piano. His hand was shaking slightly as he wrote, but he didn't erase it. The community center coordinator, a friendly middle-aged woman named Linda, appeared at his shoulder. "Oh, wonderful, another musician," she said warmly. "We love having pianists in the show. What kind of music do you play?" "Classical, mostly," David said quietly. "That's fantastic. The show is in 3 weeks and we'll have a grand piano on stage. Do you need sheet music or do you play from memory?" "Memory, even better. There's a rehearsal next Thursday evening if you'd like to get familiar with the piano. Nothing formal, just a chance to try out the instrument." David nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd actually show up to the rehearsal. "Thank you." Walking back to work, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It might have been excitement or it might have been terror. Probably both. That afternoon, his co-workers noticed the change in his mood. "You seem different today," Tommy said. "More energetic or something?" "Just a good day, I guess." "First time for everything," Pete, the older worker, said with a laugh. "Maybe you finally figured out what soap is for." The joke stung, but David didn't let it ruin his mood. For the first time in 12 years, he had something to look forward to that didn't involve fish or ice, or the smell that followed him everywhere. That evening, David played piano with more passion than usual. He worked through piece after piece, imagining what it would feel like to perform for an audience. His fingers moved confidently across the keys, playing complex classical compositions that he'd learned years ago. But then doubt started creeping in. What if people laughed at him? What if they covered their noses during his performance? What if the smell was so distracting that no one could even hear the music? David stopped playing and sat in silence. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Maybe Tommy was right. Maybe it was time to think about a different job, a different life. Maybe some people were just meant to stay in the background. But then he looked at the piano, his grandmother's piano, and remembered her words. Someday you should share this with the world. Maybe someday was now. Maybe it was time to find out if there was more to David Torres than the smell of fish and the sting of daily rejection. Maybe, just maybe, there was something inside him worth sharing. The talent show was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to decide if he was brave enough to let people see who he really was when he sat down at a piano. 3 weeks to find out if his music could speak louder than their first impressions. David put his hands back on the keys and began to play again. This time he played like he was already on that stage, performing for people who might finally see him as more than just the smelly fishmonger from Riverside Market. The days leading up to the talent show crawled by like they were moving through thick mud. David found himself checking the calendar constantly, counting down the time he had left to change his mind. 18 days, 15 days, 12 days. Each morning when he woke up, the first thought in his head was about the piano performance he'd committed to. Work became even more difficult than usual, not because the job had changed, but because David was so distracted. He kept thinking about the community center stage, the grand piano Linda had mentioned, and the audience that would be watching him. His hands shook sometimes when he was arranging fish on ice and he had to stop and take deep breaths. "You okay, man?" Tommy asked one morning when David dropped a whole tray of salmon. "You've been weird lately. Weirder than usual, I mean." "Just tired," David said, scrambling to clean up the mess. But it wasn't tiredness. It was fear mixed with something that might have been hope. David had never performed for anyone except his grandmother, and that was over 20 years ago. The thought of sitting at a piano in front of strangers made his stomach twist into knots. The rehearsal Linda had mentioned was on Thursday evening. David went back and forth about whether to attend. On one hand, it would be smart to try out the piano beforehand. On the other hand, what if other performers were there? What if they smelled him and complained? What if word got around the community that the fishy guy from the market was planning to embarrass himself on stage? Thursday afternoon, David made a decision that surprised even him. He left work early, telling Mr. Rodriguez he had a doctor's appointment. It wasn't exactly a lie. Being around people was becoming harder and harder, and maybe that was a kind of sickness. He went home and took the longest shower of his life. He scrubbed his skin until it was red, washed his hair 3 times, and used an entire bottle of body wash. Then he put on his newest clothes, the ones he only wore to church on Christmas and Easter, and sprayed himself with cologne until he could barely breathe. The community center looked different in the evening. Warmer somehow, with yellow light spilling out of the windows and people walking in and out with relaxed expressions. David stood across the street for 10 minutes, working up the courage to cross. When he finally walked through the front doors, he was surprised by how normal everything felt. A few people were chatting in the lobby, but no one paid special attention to him. He followed signs that said auditorium and found himself in a medium-sized theater with maybe 200 seats. The stage was bigger than he'd expected, with dark red curtains and professional lighting. In the center sat a beautiful black grand piano that gleamed under the spotlights. "You must be David." Linda appeared beside him with a clipboard and a big smile. "I'm so glad you came. Are you ready to try out our piano?" David nodded, not trusting his voice. Linda led him up some steps at the side of the stage. Being up there, looking out at all those empty seats made his heart race. "Take your time," Linda said. "Play whatever feels comfortable. I'll be in the back making some notes for the show order." David sat down at the piano bench and lifted the lid that covered the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned and much nicer than his grandmother's old upright. He placed his hands on the keys and paused. What if someone heard him and realized he was just a fish market worker pretending to be a musician? What if his loused hands looked ridiculous on such a beautiful instrument? What if the smell really was as bad as people said? But then David began to play and all those worries disappeared. The music that came out of the grand piano was richer and more powerful than anything he'd ever heard from his apartment piano. His fingers moved automatically through a piece by Chopin, one his grandmother had taught him when he was 14. The acoustics in the auditorium were amazing. Every note seemed to hang in the air before blending with the next one. David played for maybe 15 minutes, working through 3 different pieces, completely lost in the music. When he finally stopped, he heard clapping from the back of the theater. Linda was applauding enthusiastically. "David, that was absolutely beautiful," she called out, walking down the aisle toward the stage. "I had no idea we had such a talented musician in our community." "Where did you study?" "I didn't study anywhere," David said quietly. "My grandmother taught me when I was young." "Well, she did an incredible job. That was professional level playing. I'm so excited for the audience to hear you." David felt a warm glow in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Someone thought his music was good. Someone was excited to hear him perform. For a moment, he forgot about everything else. But walking home that night, the doubt started creeping back in. Linda had been kind and encouraging, but she was paid to be nice to everyone who participated in community events. What would real audience members think? What would happen when they saw him walk onto the stage? The next day at work, David tried to focus on his job, but his mind kept wandering to the piano. During his lunch break, he called his Aunt Rosa, his grandmother's daughter, who lived about an hour away. "David, what a surprise," Rosa said when she answered the phone. "I was just thinking about you." "How's work?" "Work is fine." "Aunt Rosa, can I ask you something?"
Do you remember Grandma's piano?
"Do you remember me playing when I was younger?" "Of course I remember." "You were so talented, honey. Your grandmother used to brag about you to everyone. She said you had magic in your fingers." "Why do you ask?" David told her about the talent show, leaving out most of the details about his daily struggles. Rosa was thrilled. "Oh, David, that's wonderful. Your grandmother would be so proud. She always said you should share your gift with the world." "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," David admitted. "That's normal. Even professional musicians get nervous. But you know what your grandmother used to say? She said music comes from the heart, and when you play from the heart, people can feel it. They don't care about anything else." After he hung up, David felt a little better, but only a little. The show was now just 1 week away, and his anxiety was getting worse instead of better. That weekend, David did something he'd never done before. He went to YouTube and searched for videos of piano performances. He watched concert pianists in formal wear playing for huge audiences. He watched kids at school recitals, nervous but determined. He watched amateur musicians performing at local events just like the one he'd signed up for. What struck him was how different all the performers looked. Some were young, some were old. Some wore expensive clothes, others wore simple outfits. Some were clearly professional musicians, others were obviously beginners. But when they played, none of that seemed to matter. The music spoke for itself. David spent hours watching these videos, trying to imagine himself on a stage like that. Some performers made mistakes and kept going. Some looked nervous at the beginning, but relaxed once they started playing. A few even looked like they were having fun. Monday at work, David overheard Tommy and Pete talking about weekend plans. "There's some community talent show thing this Friday," Pete said. "My wife wants to go. Says it's always good for a laugh." "Good for a laugh?" Tommy asked. "Yeah, you know how these things are. Bunch of people who think they have talent but really don't. It's entertaining in its own way." David's stomach dropped. What if that's how everyone saw the talent show? What if people came expecting to laugh at performers who weren't good enough for real stages? What if he was just setting himself up to be the biggest joke of all? That evening, David sat at his piano but couldn't bring himself to play. His hands felt heavy and clumsy. Every piece he tried to start sounded wrong in his head before he even began. Maybe Tommy had been right weeks ago. Maybe it was time to think about a different job, a different life. Maybe some people were meant to stay invisible, working in the background where their problems wouldn't bother anyone. David closed the piano lid and went to bed early. But he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his grandmother and the music lessons in her living room. He thought about the way her face lit up when he played something perfectly. He thought about the confidence in her voice when she said he had a gift. The talent show was 5 days away. 5 days to decide if he was going to follow through with the scariest thing he'd ever attempted, or if he was going to call Linda and make up an excuse about why he couldn't perform. 5 days to choose between safety and the chance to let people hear what lived inside him when he touched the piano keys. 5 days to find out if his grandmother had been right about the magic in his fingers. David pulled the covers over his head and tried not to think about how disappointed she would be if he gave up now. Friday morning arrived. Like a storm David had been watching approach for weeks. He woke up before his alarm, his heart already racing. Today was the day. In 12 hours, he would either be sitting at that grand piano playing for a room full of people, or he would be at home having called Linda with some excuse about being sick. Getting ready for work felt different that morning. David found himself moving slower, paying attention to details he usually ignored, the way the morning light came through his bedroom window, the sound of cars starting up in the parking lot, the weight of his work clothes as he put them on. Everything felt sharper, more real, like his senses were turned up higher than normal. At the fish market, David tried to focus on his job, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He kept checking the clock on his phone. 8 hours until the show. 7 hours, 6.5 hours. Time seemed to be moving both too fast and too slow at the same time. "You're acting really strange today," Tommy said around lunchtime. "More strange than usual." "What's going on?" David almost told him. For a moment he considered explaining about the talent show, about the piano, about the thing he'd never told anyone at work. But then he imagined Tommy's reaction, the jokes that would follow, and he changed his mind. "Just thinking about stuff," David said. "Must be some serious stuff. You dropped fish twice this morning and you've been staring off into space like someone hit you with a brick." After Tommy walked away, David pulled out his phone and almost called Linda. His finger hovered over her number in his contacts. He could say he was sick. Food poisoning from bad fish, which would be believable given where he worked, or a family emergency. Something that would get him out of performing without making him look like a coward. But then David thought about his grandmother's piano sitting in his apartment, waiting for him to come home and practice. He thought about all the evenings he'd spent playing for empty walls, wishing someone could hear the music he made. He thought about Linda's face when she'd heard him play at the rehearsal, how genuine her excitement had seemed. David put his phone away without making the call. The afternoon dragged on forever. Every customer interaction felt more awkward than usual, and David was convinced the smell was worse today because of his nervous sweating. A woman buying shrimp actually covered her nose with her sleeve and asked if he could have someone else help her. "Of course," David said, his face burning with embarrassment. He called Pete over to finish the sale. "What's wrong with you today?" Pete asked quietly after the customer left. "You smell worse than usual, and that's saying something." David wanted to explain that he was nervous about something important, something that might change how people saw him. But Pete wouldn't understand. None of them would understand. Finally, 5 o'clock came. David clocked out and practically ran from the market. He had 3 hours to get ready, and he needed every minute of them. At home, David took another marathon shower. He scrubbed every inch of his body, washed his hair multiple times, and used enough soap to clean a small restaurant. Then he put on his best clothes, the same ones he'd worn to the rehearsal. Black pants, white shirt, dark tie, the closest thing he owned to formal wear. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. The clothes fit okay, though they were a little loose from years of not eating much. His hair was neat and his face was clean-shaven. He looked respectable, professional even, but would it matter once people got close enough to smell him? David had 2 hours left before he needed to leave for the community center. He sat down at his grandmother's piano and tried to practice, but his hands were shaking too badly to play properly. Simple pieces that he'd known for years suddenly seemed impossibly difficult. "Get it together," he said out loud to himself. You can do this, but could he? David had never performed for anyone except his grandmother, and that was over 20 years ago. What if he forgot the music halfway through? What if his hands cramped up from nervousness? What if the audience reaction was so bad that he couldn't finish? He tried calling his Aunt Rosa for encouragement, but she didn't answer, probably at dinner with her family, living her normal life with normal people who didn't have to worry about smelling like fish or embarrassing themselves in front of their community. With 1 hour left, David made a final decision about what to play. He'd been going back and forth between several pieces, but now he settled on Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he'd played at the rehearsal. It was beautiful, emotional, and he knew it perfectly. If he was going to succeed or fail, it would be with music that meant something to him. The walk to the community center felt like the longest 20 minutes of David's life. With each step, he had to fight the urge to turn around and go home. His palms were sweating, his heart was racing, and his stomach felt like it was full of angry butterflies. But he kept walking. The community center was bustling with activity when he arrived. Families were streaming through the front doors, many carrying flowers or cameras. Everyone looked excited and happy, dressed up for a fun evening out. David felt like he was crashing a party where he didn't belong. Linda spotted him near the entrance and hurried over with her clipboard. "David, you look wonderful. Are you ready for your big night?" "I think so," David said, though his voice came out shakier than he'd intended. "You're going to be fantastic. We have a full house tonight, maybe 150 people. The piano is all tuned and ready for you. You're performing 8th, right after the Martinez family dance and before Susan's poetry reading." 150 people. David's head spun a little. He'd been imagining maybe 50 or 60 audience members. Not a packed auditorium. Linda led him backstage, which was really just a small area behind the curtains with folding chairs and a table with water bottles. Other performers were getting ready, and David tried to stay in the background. The Martinez family was practicing dance steps in their colorful costumes. A teenage girl was warming up her voice with scales. A man in a cape was checking his magic trick props. Everyone looked confident and excited. They belonged here in a way that David didn't feel he did. "First up tonight, we have Jennifer Walsh singing Amazing Grace," Linda announced to the backstage area. "Places, everyone." David found a chair in the corner and tried to calm his breathing. Through the curtains, he could hear the audience settling into their seats, the low murmur of conversation and laughter. Normal people having a normal evening, expecting to be entertained. Jennifer's performance went well, earning enthusiastic applause. Then came Bob Chen with his magic tricks, which had the audience laughing and clapping. The Martinez family got a standing ovation for their traditional dance. With each successful performance, David felt more and more out of place. These people knew how to entertain an audience. They understood how to connect with people, how to make them happy. What did David know about any of that? "David Torres, you're up next," Linda whispered, appearing at his elbow. This was it. No more time to worry or practice or change his mind. David stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward the curtain opening that led to the stage. The auditorium was indeed packed. Every seat seemed to be filled with people chatting quietly, checking their programs, adjusting in their chairs. The stage lights were bright and warm, and the grand piano sat in the center like a beautiful black island. David walked across the stage, very aware of every step. He could feel the audience's attention focusing on him, could sense people trying to figure out who he was and what he was going to do. He reached the piano bench and sat down, adjusting it slightly. The keys gleamed under the stage lights, waiting for him to begin. David looked out at the audience one more time and saw faces he recognized from around town. The grocery store cashier, Kevin, was there with his family. Several customers from the fish market sat in the third row. Tommy and Pete were near the back, probably there for the entertainment value Pete had mentioned. David placed his hands on the piano keys and took a deep breath. Everything he'd worked toward for the past 3 weeks came down to this moment. Either his music would speak louder than people's first impressions, or it wouldn't. He closed his eyes and began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. David felt it resonate through the grand piano, through the stage, through his entire body. For a split second, the auditorium was completely silent. Then the second note followed, and the third, and suddenly the opening melody of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major was flowing from his fingers like water finding its natural course. The nervousness that had been eating at him for weeks simply vanished. There was only David, the piano, and the music. His hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who spent his days handling fish and ice. Years of evening practice in his small apartment had trained his muscles to remember every nuance of this piece. His calloused fingertips, which customers found so off-putting at the market, now coaxed the most delicate sounds from the piano strings. The music started soft and contemplative, like a conversation with an old friend. David played the opening phrase with the kind of tenderness his grandmother had taught him, each note carefully shaped and placed. In the audience, people stopped rustling their programs. Conversations faded to nothing. Even the teenagers who had been whispering in the back rows fell silent. As the piece developed, David felt himself sinking deeper into the music. The melody grew more complex, more emotional, building toward the passionate middle section that always gave him goosebumps when he played it at home. His left hand provided a steady, heartbeat-like bass line, while his right hand danced through the intricate melody. This was the David that no one at the fish market had ever seen. This was the David his grandmother had believed in, the one she'd said had magic in his fingers. Every rejection, every wrinkled nose, every whispered comment about smell and social awkwardness fell away. Here, at this piano, David was exactly who he was meant to be. The music swelled into the most dramatic section of the piece. David's hands moved with increasing confidence and passion, his whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He wasn't thinking about technique or mistakes or what the audience might be thinking. He was simply letting the music pour out of him the way it had been waiting to do for years. In the third row, Mrs. Patterson sat with her mouth slightly open. This was the same man who had served her fish just that morning, the one her daughter had complained about. But watching him play, she couldn't reconcile the two images. The musician on stage seemed like a completely different person. Kevin, the grocery store cashier, was having a similar experience. He had always been polite but distant with David, processing his purchases quickly to minimize contact. Now he was watching David's hands create something beautiful and wondering how he had missed this entirely. Near the back, Tommy and Pete looked stunned. They had come expecting to see their co-worker embarrass himself, maybe get a few laughs out of his amateur attempt at performance. Instead, they were hearing music that belonged in a concert hall, played by someone they realized they had never really known at all. The nocturne moved into its final section, the melody returning to the gentle, contemplative mood of the opening, but now enriched by everything that had come before. David played these last phrases with extra care, knowing that the piece was almost over and not wanting to let go of this moment. When the final note faded into silence, the auditorium remained completely still for what felt like forever. David lifted his hands from the keys and looked up at the audience. For the first time since he'd started playing, what he saw took his breath away. Every single person in the auditorium was staring at him with expressions of amazement. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others looked like they'd just witnessed something impossible. No one was covering their nose or stepping away or making jokes about smell. Then someone in the middle section started clapping. The sound broke whatever spell had held the audience silent, and suddenly, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. But this wasn't polite, encouraging applause like the other performers had received. This was the kind of applause reserved for professional concerts, powerful and sustained and full of genuine appreciation. People began standing up. First just a few in the front rows, then entire sections until the whole audience was on their feet, giving David a standing ovation. The applause went on, washing over him like a warm wave. David sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. He had dreamed of playing for people, but he had never imagined anything like this. Through the stage lights, he could see individual faces in the crowd. Mrs. Patterson was clapping enthusiastically, beaming at him like he was her own son. Kevin was shaking his head in amazement while he applauded. Even Tommy and Pete were on their feet, looking embarrassed about their earlier assumptions. Linda appeared at the side of the stage, gesturing for David to stand up and take a proper bow. He rose shakily from the piano bench, his legs feeling unsteady after sitting still for so long. The applause somehow got even louder when he stood. David gave a small, awkward bow, still not quite believing what was happening. The audience kept clapping, and some people started whistling and cheering. He had never heard his name called out with appreciation before, but now voices from the crowd were shouting, "Bravo!" and "Beautiful!" Finally, the applause began to die down, and David made his way off the stage. Backstage, the other performers crowded around him with congratulations and amazement. "That was incredible," said Jennifer, the singer who had opened the show. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "I had no idea we had a professional musician in our community," said Bob the magician, but David barely heard their compliments. He was still processing what had just happened on that stage. For 20 minutes, he had been exactly who he wanted to be, sharing the music that lived inside him with people who could appreciate it. After the show ended, David tried to slip out quietly through the back exit, but people kept stopping him. Mrs. Patterson found him near the door and grabbed his hands. "David, honey, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said, tears still visible in her eyes. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry for how rude Rebecca was at the market. She doesn't understand what a special person you are." Kevin approached next, looking embarrassed. "Man, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like, Well, like you were just the guy from the fish market. I had no idea you could do something like that. That was amazing. Even Tommy and Pete made their way over, both looking sheepish. Dude, Tommy said, shaking his head. Why didn't you ever tell us you could play piano like that? That was like professional level stuff. We've been working next to a real musician this whole time, Pete added. I feel like an idiot for some of the things I've said. The conversations continued for another hour. Person after person approached David to tell him how much his performance had moved them. Some shared stories about family members who had played piano. Others asked if he gave lessons or performed at other venues. For the first time in 12 years, David found himself at the center of positive attention. People wanted to talk to him, to know more about him, to connect with the person who had created such beautiful music. The smell that had defined his social interactions for so long seemed completely irrelevant now. Walking home that night, David felt like he was floating. The applause was still ringing in his ears, and he kept replaying the amazed expressions on people's faces. His grandmother had been right all along. He did have something special to share with the world. Back in his apartment, David sat down at his old upright piano and played the nocturne again. It sounded different somehow, smaller and more intimate after the grand piano, but still beautiful, still his. He thought about going to work on Monday, about seeing Tommy and Pete and Mr. Rodriguez and all the customers who had treated him like he was invisible or unpleasant. Things would be different now. Not because the smell had magically disappeared or because his job had changed, but because people had seen who he really was underneath all their assumptions. David played until well past midnight, working through piece after piece, feeling more like himself than he had in years. The lonely fishmonger who smelled like his work would always be part of who he was. But now everyone knew there was so much more to David Torres than met the nose. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Someday you should share this with the world. Tonight, he finally had. And the world had listened with wonder and applauded with joy, seeing past everything superficial to the music that lived in his heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, David had discovered something precious. When you have the courage to show people who you really are, they might just surprise you with their ability to see past everything that doesn't matter to the thing that does.